And from the national headquarters of RT America right here in our nation's capital, hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez, and there seems to be something going on that we haven't quite seen before. And let me apologize. Let me apologize ahead of time because this discussion might get a little bit indelicate. Here is your world. This is an amazing journey we're going to take you on, and let me begin by showing you, rather than telling you, our first picks. This is from Chile, and this is what's going on in Santiago, Chile. A state of emergency has been declared, and more than 11 people have already been killed in the protesting, where workers say they are simply fed up with what they call severe economic inequality under a president who calls them, quote, the enemy. What do you say we go to the UK? Again, look at this. A protest that has everything to do with workers and the national economy. More than 1 million people taking to the streets this weekend in London. It's being called one of the largest public demonstrations in British history as the crowd screamed at the Parliament about Brexit, most of them wanting, they say, a brand new referendum. Now, I'm going to take you to Lebanon. Again, a nationwide general strike has been called across the country as protesters demand, you guessed it, economic justice. They say that their government is corrupt and charging them for things like WhatsApp calls that they say should not be taxed, they should be free. We're learning that banks there are going to remain closed tomorrow as the protests now head into their 6th day. Okay, let's go to Spain. There, the protesters, angry that their leaders were charged for wanting independence for the province of Catalonia. They have been protesting now for a full week, nonstop. Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, meanwhile, referring to the protesters as radical elements who are acting violently, he says, for show. France, there, just this week, police used tear gas against thousands of firefighters who marched through Paris because of what they call low pay for their risky job, in a protest that ended, ironically enough, with firefighters facing off with police. I mean, that's as unusual as it gets. Police officers and firefighters fighting each other. The Yellow Vest protests are going on a year now, this coming November. And then, of course, there's Hong Kong, seemingly perennial protests that have the youth of what used to be the richest city in the world demonstrating for equality. And it seems odd, but the more they protest, the worse the economy of their once vaulted city becomes. Okay, now, for the indelicate part of this conversation, it is extremely newsworthy that all of these protests have been taking place all over the world, is it not? That's why we're bringing you the story. But you know what may be even more noteworthy? Did you notice something about all of these protesters? They weren't all confined to one oppressed minority, nor were they demonstrating against racial injustice, nor were they made up mostly of the poor. No, no. They're generally workers and or students, most of them white, fighting for economic equality in places where we don't even usually hear of protests. We're going to drill down on this sudden phenomena with reports on 3 of those places, case studies, if you will, as we focus even more on what's going on in general throughout this week. This is the news with Rick Sanchez, where, yeah, we do things a little different. We cover the trends that others fail to. You know why? Because we think it's time to do news again. And now to our list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. What is the signal being sent by the worldwide protest in places where they're not expected? Are things finally calming down in Hong Kong or intensifying? And just how bad are things for Israelis Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll tell you. But let's kick things off with our A block with perhaps the most perplexing of all protests, Chile. Chile has always been singled out as the miracle nation of Latin America, a testament to what can suddenly happen when government and social programs are eliminated and replaced with businesses taking over. Privatize everything, and you'll see how great things will be, said economist Milton Friedman to the Chicago Boys. Well, to some extent, that did seem to work quite well until suddenly it didn't. Patricio Zamorano is somebody who understands Chile very well. He's the co-director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. You are from Chile, right?
I am
You're
from
a
Chile.
Chileno, as we like to say.
Exactly, I am.
Explain to us who is actually protesting and why are they protesting?
Sure, and the beauty of this situation is that we as Piñera is calling it the enemy, we don't have an enemy, it's just the people.
Piñera is the president.
Exactly.
Right.
Sebastián Piñera is the right-wing president of Chile. It's the second time he actually ran for president, and he's governing the country. And he's facing just the upset reaction of the people. We have to remember that Chile is extremely neoliberal now. The health system is totally private. We have the pension system is also private. Salaries are extremely low.
Wow.
In Chile, 70% of the population.
But I have to interrupt you because this is the complete opposite of everything we here in America have always been told. We are told that Chile is the pinnacle, the one success story in Latin America, a country where the market-driven policies of Milton Friedman were put in place, and the right wing here looks at it and says, "Oh, beautiful country." Is this not true?
That's just the macro index. It's not the real life of every single person. 70% of the workers makes actually less than $700 every single month. It's unbelievable. The salary level is extremely low. You don't have any social policies to help the population. The life is extremely expensive, so you have to be careful. It's very misleading, those numbers.
So that
inflation is low, unemployment is kind of okay, but that doesn't describe the actual situation of the Chilean people.
That's interesting because what we're talking about is Chile is the example of the Chicago Boys, the Milton Friedman, who brought the businessmen from Chile there, and then it was really consummated during the Pinochet era, where everything was let the dollar or let the money, the peso rule, right? Not the government. And you're saying in the process of doing that, they've ignored the people's needs.
Exactly, and the main situation is the fact that you have to remember that the social policies are extremely important in our continent. What's going on in Chile is exactly the same situation that is going on in Ecuador and Argentina. Right-wing governments, they eliminate subsidies, they eliminate the basic protections to the people. And in Chile, we have a very big, extensive, poor middle class. So that's the real situation. Well, so increasing the fee of the metro system, of the bus system, really hits a lot of people.
So really what we're talking about is inequality. And I mean, the policies have been geared toward helping the very wealthy, and they have, hoping the wealthy would then, as we like to say in America, trickle down. You're saying it hasn't trickled down, and they've literally taken away things that used to help the workers and the poor.
Sure, 2% of the population, the richest 2% of the population enjoys basically 50% of the income of the country. It's extremely unequal. Chile is number 5 in the world in inequality. So that's an explanation for the situation right now.
What about education, healthcare, other social services?
Everything is private in Chile. If you don't have money, if you don't have a good salary, you have a horrible health system. You don't have pensions that are actually decent. So it's based on your income.
But you're saying it's private as if by saying it's private, I understand that's a bad thing. Sometimes private is a good thing. Well, why is it a bad thing?
But in Chile, it's bad because it's based on your income. So if you have very low salaries, 50% of the population making less than $700 a month, it really affect the quality of health, the quality quality of every single service that you need to hire. So if you don't have money, horrible quality of life in Chile. That's the basic problem right now.
And this is what Sebastián Piñera, the president, who said today, those people protesting are my enemy, and I'm very happy. That's what he seems to not get, and this is a trend we're now seeing, not just in Chile, but in other countries around the world that we always tend to think are doing very well. You are a very good guest, Patricio Zamorano. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing your information with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Now to the other odd place where most people are marveling at the violence and the anger that is being demonstrated on the streets of Barcelona. Once again, this is a story that is more than anything else a reflection of economic frustration. And once again, it's a story that's being ignored by the U.S. networks who choose instead to only focus on Kurdish frustration at this particular point in time, probably for political reasons. We have a correspondent who's following this story for you. She is in Barcelona. Here now, RT's Madina Kochenova.
One country, one nation. Well, not when it comes to Spain. The state is once again divided over Catalonia and its independence. It's 2 years since the referendum, and it hasn't gone much further than that. And it seems there is not much clarity over the issue. So are you Spanish or are you Catalanian? Well, it's hard to decide even for the country's leading newspaper that came out on Saturday with two different headlines. Well, this is a national edition, and it says, "Massive March of Independence for the Freedom of the Damned." And this one says, "Violent groups spread chaos in the center of Barcelona." Barcelona has become the epicenter of the separation movement and is literally on fire every day. Some protesters take the idea of independence to the extreme. While the Catalan president says violence has never been their path, radical groups have spread throughout the city, hijacking the protest. And what has been the response from Pedro Sanchez's government?
The government of Spain reiterates that the problem of Catalonia is not independence, which will not occur because it's not legal, and nor do the majority of Catalans want it, but rather coexistence.
Madrid could still trigger Article 155 of the Constitution, which would allow it to suspend the regional government and assume direct rule. But so far, Prime Minister Sanchez has fallen short of doing this. He's facing a general election in November, and right now, it's not looking good. These protests and the lack of response might prove fatal to the central government. Sanchez has been accused of sticking his head in the sand over the crisis.
Sanchez says that with moderation, everything will end up going where it has to. There can be no dialogue with those who make Catalonia burn.
The government cannot remain paralyzed before this tsunami of violence. Mr. Sanchez, Article 155, we are late.
It's not unusual for Spain, though. The Pact of Forgetting, adopted after Franco died and his regime fell, basically allowed the new government to not deal with anyone or anything Franco-related. Like, move on, nothing to see here. But will this approach work nowadays? Or is it time to take heads out of the sand and finally face the problem? Because until they do, Catalonia could be burning.
And let's take you from Barcelona to Hong Kong, where this weekend protests were, alas, supposed to be peaceful. But that is not how it went down. Chaos spread through Kowloon Sunday as an unauthorized rally took a violent turn within just hours. RT's Michele Greenstein is on the ground for us there with the very latest developments.
Sunday afternoon, a march organized by the Hong Kong Civil Human Rights Front begins in Kowloon. Now, even though this march and rally has been banned by the Hong Kong police, citing past incidents where marches organized by the same group have ended with violence, people have been out in full force for the better part of the afternoon. The march may be illegal, but it's peaceful, and no arrests are made, but not for long. First comes the graffiti and the vandalization. Some start destroying the sidewalk to stock up on bricks. The strategy is to use umbrellas to shield themselves from cameras. At times, protesters form a supply line, moving these umbrellas and other items like masks to the front lines. They build barricades on public streets. Some vandalize a government office. Some force open shops with links to the mainland. They also vandalize metro stations. And around 3 p.m., the targeted arson attacks begin. Some protesters start to surround the police station and throw petrol bombs over the fence. Police deploy tear gas from the rooftop in an attempt to disperse the crowd. As usual, it's ineffective because the protesters are wearing gas masks and protective gear. Some even throw the canisters back at the police. Eventually, the water cannon comes out, and the protesters run away. Sometimes it's laced with blue dye, a way, the police say, to identify suspects later. As the night sets in, the police are trying to round up some of the last protesters that are still out here on the streets from the earlier, more violent clashes this afternoon. Riot police clear the main streets, chasing black-clad protesters and making arrests. To avoid arrest, the protesters run away and change out of their black clothes on side streets and in alleyways. They return in their non-implicating outfits to taunt the police. The police remain until the main streets are cleared out, and all that's left is destruction, remnants of shops, restaurants, and banks targeted because of their links to the mainland.
To watch the way you show it, Michele, it almost seems, well, it seems very orchestrated, especially that part there where you show the changing of the clothes. It's also impressive to think that everyone is looking for some kind of peace to break out, pardon the pun, and yet every time these protests are announced, they continue to be violent. It's pretty amazing. Michele's joining us now. As you can see, they're live from Hong Kong. Michele?
Rick, I want to bring you to what's been a controversy, both here in Hong Kong's local media and in the international media. Now, during that same Sunday afternoon, as police were using water cannons to disperse the crowd, they say accidentally sprayed a nearby mosque with this water cannon that was actually laced with blue dye, dyeing the front entrance of the mosque blue. Now, this has become such a controversy in local media here, to the point where Chief Executive Carrie Lam actually had to visit that mosque and offer her apologies and explain herself on behalf of the Hong Kong police. Now, the imam said that they accept the government's explanation that this was not intentional, that this was just part of their operations of dispersing the protesters. And in a police press conference, the police say that before any operations, they speak with the stakeholders in the area, and then after, when they learned this had happened, they did offer their apologies. But they say that it's actually what they call the rioters who have more to apologize for to the Hong Kong people, and it's only because the Hong Kong rioters were using violence that the police were, quote-unquote, forced to respond using force to disperse them. Now, this is why I want to bring you to something called the marginal violence theory, which is a strategy that's been circulating in online forums. And the ideology is essentially this: police brutality brings people onto the streets. Every time there's a photo or a video of the Hong Kong police using force on protesters, it mobilizes people and gets them angry about this police brutality, as many would say they should be, and it brings them to these large, wide-scale marches like the one we saw Sunday afternoon that later ended up turning violent. Now, ideally, in the marginal violence theory, the ideal outcome is for the police to overreact and use too much force, and this would allow for headlines, videos, photos of the police using force, and then, of course, we can mobilize public support in favor of the protesters. This is what the Hong Kong protesters are doing. We saw it with that infamous gunshot. You may remember that About 3 months into this anti-government movement, a Hong Kong police officer fired his revolver into the air as a warning shot, not actually injuring anyone. But this gunshot was seen in all media nonstop, that this officer had raised his gun. It was a photo that went very viral. However, the events leading up to that, which was that an angry mob was chasing an outnumbered group of police officers down the street with metal bars, was not as widely reported. So it's usually that the events leading up to the police violence are not widely reported, but then the police reacting using force is heavily reported. So we see that every day here in Hong Kong with photos and videos, and just the latest example is this so-called mosque controversy. Now, the police, when asked who is supplying these protesters, Rick, who they're affiliated with, and what kind of training they've been receiving, since you asked, that it looks very organized, they say that this is also a point of inquiry for them, but they are not allowed to comment any further on these investigations. However, this is kind of a development, because the last time I was here in Hong Kong, around the middle of August, when I asked both Hong Kong government officials and the Hong Kong police if there was an investigation into who was supplying these protesters, they said there was no investigation. Now, in terms of the underlying social conditions, I can't help but mention the inequality that's in Hong Kong. Since you began this program, speaking of protest movements in other areas of the world where their main, grievance is economic grievances, the same situation is here in Hong Kong. We've got widespread inequality. The minimum wage does not keep up with inflation. Privatization often runs unchecked because it's a very market-driven economy. Now, the vast majority of Hong Kongers here have those economic grievances. At the same time, a lot of them do not agree with the violent tactics, but do concede that something needs to change here in Hong Kong, that the Hong Kong government needs to stop just representing what they call the top 5% of Hong Kongers. So even though they may condemn this violence, they feel like something needs to change, and they may not come out right and say that.
Just for a point of clarification, Michele, you mentioned the marginal violence theory. Sounds like more of a strategy. Is that a playbook that was created by someone and then maybe handed over to the protest organizers? Or if you could explain that to us a little more.
Sure, this is certainly something that we know at least some Hong Kong protesters are employing, this strategy. One protester actually disclosed this theory to the New York Times in an article called One Hong Kong Protester Strategy. I believe it was Get the Police to Hit You. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And in this article, it really lays out that police brutality is what mobilizes people.
Michele Greenstein, as usual, doing yeoman's work for us there, bringing us up to date on the situation in Hong Kong. Thank you, Michele. And this is where we get a chance to hear not just from our correspondents and our reporters and our writers and researchers, but from you. We think it's important to hear from you and to see how you react to the many different stories that we present on a nightly basis. And boy, I'll tell you what, you guys are really critical of the U.S.'s Congress meddling in Hong Kong protests just last week. Remember when the House, not the Senate yet, they still have to vote on it, but the House passed the Hong Kong Democracy Act? And a lot of you got lit up over this one. We'll start with Steve Yap. He says this is purely a covert operation of the West. Does Saudi Arabia have better human rights practices than Hong Kong, he asks. Roger Van Ryke says the CIA riots have destroyed the real freedom of Hong Kong. Teofilo says the so-called human rights bill is designed to split the Chinese. That is the only intention. That's also what it's called, by the way, the Democracy Act or Human Rights Bill. And then JTT says the U.S. government should accept the Hong Kong rioters as immigrants. And then finally, Dolores chimes in with, I wonder what the U.S. would do if China passed laws regarding Guam or, say, Puerto Rico. This is crazy, she adds. Write to us right here on YouTube, where we post all of our best clips on a nightly basis. Also, just because we don't use what you wrote to us and post it here doesn't mean that we're not engaging, that we're not sharing with you, either myself or members of our staff, on a nightly basis. And one other thing. First of all, we want to thank you, because just recently we went from something like 400,000 to over 1 million subscribers. We did it very fast, And we did it in large measure because you guys say you like what we're doing. We thank you. By the way, all of us here at RT want you to know that our clips are now seen in real time, and you can subscribe in real time, which is something we weren't doing before. See that right there, that little subscribe thing we've got circled? Hit that while you're actually watching the segment, and then you too will be part of our family where we can share information with each other. Now, something else we want to tell you about tonight. After 150 years, researchers have finally uncovered an ancient city in Cambodia that was one of the first capitals in the Khmer Empire. RT's Trinity Chavez has the story.
For centuries, the ancient city of Mahendrapavarta has been buried deep within a Cambodian jungle. The once mighty metropolis was one of the first capitals of the Khmer Empire, which ruled in Southeast Asia between the 9th and 15th centuries. But while the city was sometimes referred to as the lost city of Cambodia, others say the city was never lost, but actually hidden. The sprawling city of Mahendrapavarta has long been rumored to exist, but has been hidden for centuries by the lush jungle of modern-day Cambodia. Over the last 150 years, researchers observed nearly 600 newly discovered remnants of the ancient civilization, which included shrines, a royal palace, and even a pyramid-shaped temple. But they didn't have enough evidence to support the link until now. The new research published by Cambridge University has confirmed the location of Mahendrapavarta in a Cambodian mountain range called Phnom Kulen. The researchers said in a statement, despite knowing that the Phnom Kulen mountains likely hid traces of a Khmer capital city, archaeologists have had difficulty accessing the region. The mountains are covered in dense vegetation, and they were one of the last strongholds of Khmer Rouge guerrillas until the 1990s. Landmines and unexploded ordnances continue to pose a threat to communities living and working in the mountains and complicate archaeological research. Archaeologists have been trying to rediscover the ancient city for centuries, but was extremely difficult to find because the site had been covered with dense trees that make it hard to observe. In fact, archaeologists had to harness laser technology to locate the mysterious city. So the researchers combined airborne laser scans and ground surveys, and with this technology, they were able to find it. The city is arranged in a giant grid, which would make Mahendrapavarta one of the first engineered landscapes of the era. But until recently, according to the researchers behind the paper, the area has received little attention. Now that the civilization has a confirmed location, it could give new insight into how cities were built more than 1,000 years ago. Reporting in New York, Trinity Chavez, RT.
Hey, thanks so much, Trinity. Hey, and thank you for being with us tonight. If you have some friends or somebody you know who's looking for a newscast that's really not like the rest of them, in fact, we would argue nothing like the rest of them, tell them we're here and tell them they can catch us on YouTube. And tomorrow we'll join you again when it'll be time, well, to do news again. See you then.